Alright, we're back with another rambling video, and we're going to talk about something a little different today. We're not going to talk about video games, we're going to talk about reading. Bum bum bum, reading is scary. At least to me it is. But before we get into that, before we get into why reading is so scary and so terrifying and evil, let's go over my history with reading. So, I guess just to get expectations right out of the gate, I don't read a lot. I'd like to, but I don't. So, I'll just put that out for now. And going back to like where I started reading at an early age. That's something my parents really pushed on me, is to just be reading. I didn't read a lot, I was read to a lot. And I read some books, but at some point in life, I just kind of stopped. I'm trying to think of like what was the first, because you know there's a bunch of like kiddie books when you're young, and then there's some point where you're like, okay, you progress into, I'm trying to think of like older kid, like The Hobbit. That's kind of like a kid's book almost, but there's like a point where you jump from like the very hungry caterpillar to The Hobbit, and I never made that jump to like quote more adult books. Once I was done, once I had reached the age where I was like, okay, it's time to move on, I just didn't. But that's not to say, you know, I became illiterate or anything. I just didn't care about reading books on my own time. I'd rather, I guess this was around the time where I started playing video games, which is, you know, any time I could have spent into reading, I'd just rather be playing video games. You know, that came with reading of its own way. You know, you're reading in-game text and you're just reading in-game text. That's all there is. Yeah. But when it came to books, I don't know what it was. I just never found myself interested. Or comic books either. I didn't really get into comic books at an early age. That seems like something that a lot of kids get into with like, I was gonna say like Spider-Man, but I guess like young kids, they didn't read Spider-Man comics. They watched the movie. And that was what made them into Spider-Man fans. And they watched the Spider-Man movies, played the Spider-Man video games, but didn't really read the comics. Anyway. The first series I really remember getting into that I like actually read. I'm just gonna pause here, let you guess. Maybe type out a comment or something, think about it in your head. What series did you think I was really into as a kid? Captain Underpants. Yeah, Captain Underpants, how about that? Was a big fan of Captain Underpants. That was, I'm not good with remembering like timelines of my life, but must have been like early teenager, preteen. No, it must have been before teenager. Like 9 or 10. It's like poop jokes, toilet jokes, just like juvenile stuff, but that was fun. There was like these comic book sections, and Captain Underpants is like a superhero doing superhero stuff. I was in the perfect target demographic for that series. And I got a lot of books. I still have them laying around, you know, up to book 8 or something. Then I stopped reading at some point and stopped paying attention, I guess. It must have been around like 9 or 10. Maybe, I don't know. Like I said, I'm bad with these ages. Before that, was it before that? I don't know. At some point earlier in my life, I remember my dad reading Harry Potter to me. And I never read it, but I remember him reading it to me. We got it from like the library or something. That's something a lot of younger kids got into. I think I must have been younger than when I was like the tail end of when I was into Captain Underpants. It must have been earlier than that. I guess Captain Underpants is more of a guilty pleasure at that point in my life. But Harry Potter never got into that. That's like, I feel like that's the gateway to reading for a lot of kids around my age. But never got into it. Later on down the line, I did find some books I was interested in, like towards high school. I got really into, how do I introduce this? I talked about in a video, or maybe it was a post I wrote on my blog, pretzel.cc, if you want to go check that out. I wrote a website post where I was talking about reading, and maybe I'll retread some of the same stuff here. That was a year or two ago, so anyway. I was really into Evil Dead 2 at the time. This was like early high school, maybe? And I was really into Evil Dead 2. And I was into Bruce Campbell specifically. I liked Evil Dead 2. That was a point where I started to appreciate movies past like what I see on screen. And I'm like, oh, there's like artists behind the creation of the film. You know, there's a director, there's actors, and they have like creative works outside of the movies. So I watched Sam Raimi's other movies. I watched Bruce Campbell's other movies. I watched Burn Notice. That was a show with like, I don't even know how to describe it. It was like some secret agents or something. I watched Burn Notice, all of it, solely because Bruce Campbell was in it. And he wasn't even like a main character. He was like a goofy buddy to the main guy. He was like third billing or something. There was like a main guy and a main girl, and then there was Bruce Campbell kind of joking around. But I watched all of that show. At least I first got into it because he was in it and he was being his goofy self. Eventually that led me into discovering that he wrote books. This actor wrote a bunch of books. Not like a whole lot, but like more than you'd think for an actor. I think he has like, at least back then, it was like 3 or 4. So I ended up getting like 3 of them at least. Maybe it was all at the time again, I don't remember, but he had some like, I think one was like a purely fiction story, and then 2 of them were like, oh, how do I describe it? It was kind of autobiographical, but it was also kind of like elements of fantasy where he'd like play up his real life events to make it seem more fantastical. Again, it's been since high school since when I read those, but I remember, you know, carrying those around when I was going to my classes. Oh my gosh, I gotta write something down. Okay, sorry. I just thought of something related to this Bruce Campbell stuff and I have to bring it up. Anyway, so I read here and there. I think I read The Road. I remember carrying that around to classes too, and I think I read like a project on it or a report. That was like stuff I did on my own time, you know, like I read Bruce Campbell's books for fun. I read The Road for fun. But reading, I feel like most people, at least in the US, maybe it's just like modern culture. I feel like most people don't read for pleasure. Their only experience to reading is like through school and what they were forced to read for classes. I was one, like most people out there, I hated it. I hated reading. I hated being forced to read something I didn't personally come to. You know, I had those Bruce Campbell books, like, those were one of the few things I did read of my own accord, and that's because I was interested in them. You know, I had this personal investment with Bruce Campbell as an actor, and like as a character throughout his movies, and like his relationship with Sam Raimi and how they were like best buddies shooting movies together. I was interested in learning more about that. But I wasn't interested in like stuff reading for history. Like reading textbooks, that's mind-numbing. Like, is my experience the norm? Do most people hate that? Do most people just try to like skirt the rules and like read as little as they can? Read like a fraction and just like guess where they on tests or homework assignments? I don't know. Maybe I'm downplaying how much. Maybe I did read more than I'm thinking I did. I just pushed through it because I hated it. You know, reading math books, literature. I mean, that's a different type of reading than to like reading a Harry Potter. But it's still reading, you know, you're looking at a book and there's no visuals and there's no like music or anything like that. You have to focus your mind solely on a page. And it's similar to reading for pleasure in that way. I think for most people, and myself included, that experience in school, that kind of paints how you view reading. It's like you have school and, you know, you go home, you have your homework, read these 4 pages for history class. And you do that, and as soon as you're done with that, you don't want to start reading Harry Potter. You want to go play Sonic Adventure. You want to go play Call of Duty. You know, you don't want to... It's too similar. At least in my mind. That was how I viewed it. I didn't want to get home, do some reading in school, do some reading for homework, and then do some more reading for pleasure. Video games were my escape. And reading books for pleasure, that wasn't an escape. That felt like being trapped in the same box. Eventually, I did major in English in college. It's kind of like the focus on creative writing, but I did have to end up taking a lot of literature classes. And those classes were the bane of my existence. That's like, I mean, I guess it's better than reading textbooks, like reading Frankenstein or a Shakespeare play. He wrote plays, right? I guess reading those are better than reading a textbook about like history or math. But literature, that was just so mind-numbing. I did not want to do that. SparkNotes was my best friend during that time. Those literature classes were rough. I mean, that was a couple years ago. My mindset has changed about reading over the years. I've come to see it as like, oh, it's a thing you should enjoy rather than dread. But that sticks with you. You know, those feelings where it's like, okay, I gotta force myself to sit down and read Frankenstein. I remember that because that's like one of the very few books I remember having to read. Or King Lear. I think we read that for an English class. It's an exercise in frustration. You know, it requires so much brain power for me to just sit down, focus my eyes, and just read something. I don't have that personal connection to the book. You know, with Bruce Campbell, as I said, I got, like, it's an actor I like. I have no personal connection to King Lear. I don't care about the story. I don't care about Shakespeare. I don't care about the meta-narrative surrounding it and everything it inspired. You know, maybe if I had saw, like, a movie or something that it was inspired by King Lear, maybe I would have been interested in, like, reading the original to see, like, how it compares. Maybe I'll talk about something like that in a minute. But I didn't have that connection. I think a connection is very important for me, personally. Yeah, I just didn't vibe with the older writing. And these days, I guess I'll talk about it now, a lot of what I read and have read in the past is because of connections to other media from other mediums. Again, going back to Bruce Campbell's books, I got into those because I was interested in him as an actor. Would I read some random actor's autobiography or some fantasy novel of some actor I've never even heard of? No. I went in the bookstore recently and I saw that there was like an autobiography section, and you can see all these books written by people with their faces on it. And it's just like, why would I pick up a book written by a face I know? And I kind of know their history. I know about like movies they've been in and what they've done and throughout the years, but I don't have a connection to them. I guess that's what drives me, is that connection to another media that I'm interested in. Because I'm primarily like a video game, movie, TV person. That's the media I consume. That's what I've always consumed. Reading I have to go out of my way to do. But I've always had this like fascination, this like, I observe from a distance and I'm like, man, I really wish I could. But when I have that strong connection, I make the jump to reading it. So what's a recent example? Dune. I saw that the Dune movie was coming out. This was a couple years ago before it actually came out. I saw it was coming out, and I had like known about it beforehand, but of course I never read it. I was like, oh, there's that. They're making a book about that movie. Making a movie about that book that's been around for a while. And Dune's kind of attained this like cultural, I don't even know what you say, cultural weight, where people see it as like this extremely influential sci-fi novel, and how it's influenced. Now that I've have to name them, I can't think of any. There was a worm in Star Wars. There was a worm in Star Wars Episode 5. There were big worms in Dune. Does that count as an influence? Anyway, I knew it was a really, really popular thing. I guess as would become a trend in my life, or I guess had already been a trend in my life, I like to get in at the ground floor before like adaptations like that come out. I want to be someone who has read the book before the movie, who can say, you know, I was a fan before, not necessarily because of like some ego thing, like I want to be Like I want to hold myself above other people. I'm like, huh, I read the book before seeing the movie. I'm better than you. Not that kind of thing. It's more of like I want to have an appreciation for the adaptation. You know, if you haven't seen either Dune the movie or read Dune the book, the way you see both of those, you can only do once. So, either, assuming you do both, you can only read Dune first and then see the movie, or see the movie first and then read the book. Does that make sense? In which order you read or consume that media in, you know, if you see the book and then see the movie, that affects how you view the book or the movie going forward. I'm trying to think of an example for this. I guess I'll just stick with Dune. So Dune I didn't start reading until trailers had come out. And when I saw those trailers, I did watch one or two of them, and I see all the characters and then they're on the titular Dune, Arrakis. And you see these visuals in the trailer and in the movie, and those become like part of the character. Those are like part of the story. So how I see Paul Atreides look in the movie as... can't remember his name. I guess we'll go to Duke Leto Atreides. Duke Leto Atreides. Slow down. I can pronounce this. Duke Leto Atreides. You see him in the trailer, Oscar Isaac. And when I read the book, I picture in my mind Oscar Isaac from the trailer. And that's... I don't like that. I don't like that I have this connection that wasn't there when the book was written. It kind of... I have a copy of The Hobbit, and it has illustrations in it. And I haven't read it. I've read some of it. And some of the illustrations of like The Hobbit and Gandalf and the dwarves, they look nothing like the interpretations in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. You know, when I think Bilbo Baggins, I think of Martin Freeman. And when I think of Gandalf, I think of Patrick Stewart. Is it Patrick Stewart? Patrick Stewart plays Gandalf, I think. It's been a long time since I've seen Lord of the Rings. I'm so sorry. But when I read those characters' names in the pages, I think of the characters from the movie. And even though there's like pictures of the character in the book, little illustrations, I still think of the movie characters. And I don't like that. I wish I could form these characters in my mind and then see like the filmmaker's interpretation. That's something I really want. I want to experience adaptations and, you know, sequels. I want to experience those as an existing fan, not as a new fan. And even if I did just finish Dune a week before I went to see the movie, I still have that knowledge of like what Dune is supposed to be and like what the ornithopters look like. And then when I see how they did in the movie, I'm like, huh, that's interesting. I didn't think of that. I went, I guess, as like a bonus, a bonus to that. Dune is like notorious for being pretty confusing and like not necessarily confusing, but like dense. I was kind of worried about that going in. Like, I'm not a avid reader, of course, so I was worried that it'd be hard to get into, like break into with all these fantasy planets and names. I have such a hard time following like names and books and movies when there's a lot of them, mostly. And Dune's got a lot of that. But it was easy to follow, surprisingly. And I went to see the movie with a friend, and he didn't read the book. And that kind of gave me... And he was asking me questions about it as we were driving home. And that just made me think like, wow, I can't imagine what seeing this movie would have been like if I hadn't read the book. That would have been... It'd be a completely different experience. Like, would the ending have been as satisfying as I thought it was? To someone who didn't know, like, what this set up going forward for the rest of the book? Like, what you see at the end of Dune, it's like a transformation of Paul into, like, this different character almost. And that was really cool to see. But that's only halfway through the Dune book, or, like, 2/3-ish. And I can, like, understand from an outsider's perspective, that's not really a satisfying ending. Yeah, I just kind of like I like the perspective you get on a movie or a TV show after having read it first. Because you're not sullied by whatever the filmmaker does. You have your own interpretation, and then you see, like, the book means this to me, rather than, and then you see a movie, and it's like, oh, this is their perspective, rather than if you see the movie first, it's like, oh, this is Bilbo Baggins, this is Frodo, and then you go to the book and you're like, oh, okay, this is what it is, but I'm still seeing Elijah Wood, still seeing Martin Freeman. Yeah. I guess to talk about some of the other books I've read over the past couple years. I've read Dune. I've read Your Name. That's a book. That's a novelization of a Japanese movie. I know I talked about this in my post on my website where I wrote about reading. I actually had a realization when I was writing that. Your Name, I read that just like I was talking about before. I read that because I thought the movie was based on it. The movie was coming out. I was like, oh, there's a book. So I was like, oh, I'll read it and then I'll see the movie. And then, I'll have both perspectives. So the movie doesn't influence my view of the book. And I did that, read the book, watched the movie, liked them both. I was happy. Skip forward like 3 years. I'm writing the blog post on my website about reading. And I go to Wikipedia to see when the movie came out and when the book came out. And the book came out after the movie. It was a novelization. That blew my mind. I'd read a novelization of the movie. And I didn't know until I looked this up on Wikipedia looking for something else. That just blew my mind. I was writing there, and then I was like, I opened the Wikipedia page, and I sat there stunned. I mean, it doesn't mean that much in the grand scheme of things. It was just kind of like I don't know how that slipped under my radar at the time. It was just like, man, how did I miss this? Yeah, but it was good. It was good as a book. I hear novelizations for movies or TV shows or whatever, and that always seemed like a weird idea. Movies and TV shows, they're created as visual mediums. Why would I want to see a stripped down version of that for a book? If books aren't my primary source of entertainment, I'd rather watch a movie or a TV show or play a game. But for whatever reason, I stumbled upon Your Name, and it didn't strike me at the time as oh, this was a movie adapted into a book, rather than a book adapted into a movie. Yeah, I liked it though. I recently read some Final Fantasy VII books for my video I put together on Final Fantasy VII Remake earlier this year. I read those to get that video was going to be a much bigger scope initially, but I kind of dialed it back and brought it together in what I thought was a much brighter idea. But originally I was going to cover all the books, all the spin-offs, all the everything, so I consumed every bit of Final Fantasy VII media I could. I played 2 or 3 spin-offs, read 2 books. Those were good. That was the first time I had read a book spin-off of another medium. Or another media in another medium. I feel like that happens a lot where there's Star Wars. Star Wars has the movies, and then there's a sea of novels and short stories or whatever. I'd never got into that. I had tried reading a little bit of the Thrawn trilogy. Didn't get too far into it. It seemed like a fun... I probably should have kept reading throughout that. I liked it. But the Final Fantasy VII books were my first foray into book spin-offs of games or whatever. At least now I'm more open to try that again. I heard the Doom books, they were written back in the 90s. Heard those are really good. I'd love to check those out. Had those on my Amazon wishlist for a while. So that's what I've been into these past couple years. Not a lot, but I'm glad I'm slowly getting more experience. There was a period in my life where I didn't read anything for fun. I guess I've had phases where I go in and out. Right now I'm kind of in a slump where I haven't read a lot. Well, I did have a phase a couple months ago where I read a lot of manga. I I don't want to say manga. It feels cringe. Feels like I'm LARPing. I'll say manga. Yeah, I got into that, specifically My Hero Academia. That's a series I had watched a little bit of. It was a manga adapted into an anime at some point. And I watched the anime, like the first couple seasons, years ago. And I kind of wanted to watch it again. But anime, that's a hard thing to like, at least for me personally, it's a hard thing to like section off time for. Because that's a show, for shows and movies that are subbed in another language, that's something you really have to pay attention to. Like, you have to focus and read the subtitles, every single line. You can't do something else or glance at your phone. You'll miss everything. I guess you could say I could watch it dubbed, but I am not interested in that. I'm not too snobby about it. Maybe I'm a little snobby, but for me personally, I'm not going to say what you should do. But I prefer having, like, the original voices and hearing, like, how the creators directed it. You know, I don't want some localizer's interpretation and trying to make it work in English. I mean, you have to accept some of that with subtitles. Because, you know, if you translate every Japanese word directly into English, it won't make much sense. At least for how I consume the media, there's this acceptable level of localization. But I don't want to hear the English voices being all snotty and like that. I've heard animes where characters sound exactly like that. I promise. Anyway. My Hero Academia. I wanted to watch it, but I didn't want to watch it. So I was like, I'll just read it. I'll just read the manga. So I did. I read it. That's all there is to it. I don't know what else to say. I read it, and manga's easier to get into, I guess. I guess that's my point. Than, like, traditional reading. You know, if I were to get into Harry Potter, or at least as a kid, I don't know if it had pictures, if that would have made it easier. I guess I wasn't into comic books, really. I mean, that's, like, effectively serves the same... It's like the same format as manga. I guess later in life I discovered anime. I was like, oh, most anime come from manga, so I guess I'll just read that. Yeah, and it's easier when there's, like, pictures and... Oh, God, I sound like a child when I say it like that. Like, oh, there's pictures, so it's easier. I mean, I guess it's definitionally true. It's easier to follow what's happening when there's, like, drawings and illustrations. I shouldn't feel too bad about that. You know, I think it's good. I think it helps me follow along. As stupid as that makes me sound and feel. I guess I did read a little bit before My Hero Academia. I read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I think this was when I was in high school. This was before I went to college, because I remember reading it before college. That was weird. I can't believe... I guess I was into anime and stuff earlier than I thought. Yeah, I read up to part 7. I didn't stick with a lot of that, like, part 5. I kind of rushed through manga, I think. That's the bad thing, when there's, like, pictures and you just kind of glance and there's some words and you just speed read. I'm already on to the next page, where... At least, I think I need to learn to take my time a little bit. So yeah, that's where I am these days. And so that's my past and present, and let's just talk a little bit about the future. How would I like to feel about reading? What's my goal for my perspective on reading? That's a weird thing to say, but I want to change my perspective on reading. Because these days, when I try reading, when I pick up a book or pick up my Kindle and I start reading, you know, first, you gotta get comfortable. But, you know, I kind of like to recline when I'm playing video games or watching a movie, so I'll recline when I'm reading a book. And then I'm just kind of reading, and then my eyes start to glaze over. Then I kind of start to skip words here and there, skip a line maybe, or I have to go back. And I just kind of start to go, kind of a little tired. Oh. Yeah. I get tired when I read. You know, that's if I'm reclining. If I'm laying down in my bed, that's a nightmare. I will get instantly out. Like, it's nap time. Nap time if I'm laying down in my bed. That's what my brain says. Let me know it's time to read. My brain's like, nah, fam. It's nap time. That's a hard thing to get over. That's a really hard thing to get over. I want to have a similar relationship to books like I do other media. I want to be able to sit down and just say, like, okay, I want to be able to read for like 2 hours without getting tired. Dune I got through. That was a book I read. I had read that before I went to bed, like a couple weeks, which was good because, you help get yourself ready for bed. You're not looking at a screen, rotting your eyeballs out. Just as like a point of personal growth. I want to be able to read books without getting tired and getting bored. I can play games for a while without getting bored. I can watch a movie without getting tired. I want to view books that same way. And I don't know how to do that. I got a lot of stuff I do want to read whenever I do get into reading. Lord of the Rings. I've had copies of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit on my shelf for like 6-7 years. And The Hobbit, I mentioned it earlier, that's like for kids. But Lord of the Rings, that's like a big boy book. And The Hobbit I've tried getting into, but it's always a thing where like, okay, I'll read one night. All right, I read 20 pages. I'm good, I'm going to bed. And then I'll read maybe 15 the next night, maybe 10. And then maybe I'll skip a night and read 10 the next night. And I just slowly stop being interested in it. Yeah, that's what I did with The Hobbit a few times even. I'd like to read Wheel of Time. That's like a big... Is it sci-fi? I don't know. I bought it at a bookstore. I got a gift card for Christmas last year. And then I bought the first book in the Wheel of Time series with it. And I read a little bit of it. I don't think it was sci-fi. I just kind of assumed it was sci-fi based off like the descriptions. The intro very much didn't seem like sci-fi. Maybe it takes a turn. Maybe I'm just making shit up. But that's a series with like 16 books. And I've heard it's really good. Love to get into that. Heard the Amazon show for it sucks though. It's most unfortunate. The Dune books. Love to finish the Dune series. I read the first book and that was a miracle I got through that. I pushed through that because I wanted to see the movie. And eventually, the second book, I guess the later half of the first book and the second book are going to be adapted into movies. I think the first one did well enough where we're going to start seeing more. But there's a lot of those. Dune's complex, a lot of politics and stuff. I made it through the first book and I kind of feel like there's a part where where you play a series or watch a movie series, watch a TV show where you're like, okay, I finished season 2, and then you take like a year-long break. You're like, oh my god, who are these characters? What are their relationships? You remember nothing. It's like, well, I guess I better start from the beginning. Watching a couple seasons of a TV show is a lot different to reading a 500-page book. But, yeah, I don't know what I'll do when the time comes. But I'm definitely going to have to read the rest of the Dune books before the next movies come out. And there's just a lot of old sci-fi in general I'd like to get into. I have copies of, like, Stranger in a Strange Land. What's the other one that guy wrote? Starship Troopers? Did he write that? Isaac Asimov. Did he write Foundations? Did he write Foundations? I don't know. I have a Foundation trilogy, I think it is, in there. I think it's a trilogy. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? That's a book I read in college. That was, for those who don't know, that was the book Blade Runner was based off of. And I was kind of interested in that. But I had to read it for a class, and that was one of the very few instances in my life where my interests had lined up with what I had to do for a class. That was a very... Like, it does wonders. It's so much easier to get people to read when they have connections to what they're reading. That's something I think is kind of a problem with people today, is like, nobody wants to read. Like, I want to try to get my mom to start reading. Like, she just watches, I don't know, police shows on TV and plays Candy Crush. Like, good for her. That's, whatever. Everyone has their guilty pleasures. I sure do. But, I feel like reading is good for people. more people should appreciate reading. And I'm at this point, this like turning point in my life where it's like, okay, I realize books are so like, it's such a good medium. And it's been around for so long. There's such a rich like history of things to read. Like I could stop playing video games altogether, stop watching movies and TV shows, and have plenty of books to fill my time for the rest of my life. I wouldn't feel like I was bored or anything. But maybe that's just not who I am. Maybe I should stop trying to force it. You know, I've had plenty of phases in my life where I'm like, okay, I'm not just gonna read a book. I'm gonna become a reader. And I'll buy a couple books on my Kindle. I bought a Kindle. I guess I bought that for college to read. Whatever, but I think that did help. Because when I hold a book, feels kind of awkward sometimes. But I did actually switch onto physical books recently. I'm kind of more into those than digital Kindle stuff. How do I close this out? I don't know. I just wish more people were interested in books, you know? I feel like it speaks to our hyperactive Zoomer brains of society. So, you know, we don't want to sit down and focus and read a book. We just want to scroll through Twitter or play some game that gives us constant dopamine hits. You know, as Assassin's Creed, is playing through that, is that going to stick with me for a long time? I don't know, probably not. Like, if I read The Lord of the Rings, that's something that would, at least I feel like, maybe, I don't know. It feels like something that would stick with you. That really sticks to your ribs, a good book. Or, I guess I talked about it in the last, or the video before last about long games. Like, these bloated games take up so much time. You could have spent reading a great book. Yeah. My societal advice? Stop playing Candy Crush. Pick up a damn book. That's it. Thanks for watching. Write a comment for another episode, whatever. See you around.